You are smart. You are smart. You are kind. You are kind. You are funny. You are funny. You are creative. You are creative. You are thoughtful. You are thoughtful. You are generous. You are generous. You are talented. You are talented. You are ambitious. You are ambitious. You are helpful. You are helpful. You are caring. You are caring. You aren't smart. You aren't smart. You aren't kind. You aren't kind. You aren't funny. You aren't funny. You aren't creative. You aren't creative. You aren't thoughtful. You aren't thoughtful. You aren't generous. You aren't generous. You aren't talented. You aren't talented. You aren't ambitious. You aren't ambitious. You aren't helpful. You aren't helpful. You aren't caring. You aren't caring. Are you smart? Are you smart? Are you kind? Are you kind? Are you funny? Are you funny? Are you creative? Are you creative? Are you thoughtful? Are you thoughtful? Are you generous? Are you generous? Are you talented? Are you talented? Are you ambitious? Are you ambitious? Are you helpful? Are you helpful? Are you caring? Are you caring? Aren't you smart? Aren't you smart? Aren't you kind? Aren't you kind? Aren't you funny? Aren't you funny? Aren't you creative? Aren't you creative? Aren't you thoughtful? Aren't you thoughtful? Aren't you generous? Aren't you generous? Aren't you talented? Aren't you talented? Aren't you ambitious? Aren't you ambitious? Aren't you helpful? Aren't you helpful? Aren't you caring? Aren't you caring? You will be smart. You will be smart. You will be kind. You will be kind. You will be funny. You will be funny. You will be creative. You will be creative. You will be thoughtful. You will be thoughtful. You will be generous. You will be generous. You will be talented. You will be talented. You will be ambitious. You will be ambitious. You will be helpful. You will be helpful. You will be caring. You will be caring. You won't be smart. You won't be smart. You won't be kind. You won't be kind. You won't be funny. You won't be funny. You won't be creative. You won't be creative. You won't be thoughtful. You won't be thoughtful. You won't be generous. You won't be generous. You won't be talented. You won't be talented. You won't be ambitious. You won't be ambitious. You won't be helpful. You won't be helpful. You won't be caring. You won't be caring. Will you be smart? Will you be smart? Will you be kind? Will you be kind? Will you be funny? Will you be funny? Will you be creative? Will you be creative? Will you be thoughtful? Will you be thoughtful? Will you be generous? Will you be generous? Will you be talented? Will you be talented? Will you be ambitious? Will you be ambitious? Will you be helpful? Will you be helpful? Will you be caring? Will you be caring? Won't you be smart? Won't you be smart? Won't you be kind? Won't you be kind? Won't you be funny? Won't you be funny? Won't you be creative? Won't you be creative? Won't you be thoughtful? Won't you be thoughtful? Won't you be generous? Won't you be generous? Won't you be talented? Won't you be talented? Won't you be ambitious? Won't you be ambitious? Won't you be helpful? Won't you be helpful? Won't you be caring? Won't you be caring? You have been smart. You have been smart. You have been kind. You have been kind. You have been funny. You have been funny. You have been creative. You have been creative. You have been thoughtful. You have been thoughtful. You have been generous. You have been generous. You have been talented. You have been talented. You have been ambitious. You have been ambitious. You have been helpful. You have been helpful. You have been caring. You have been caring. You haven't been smart. You haven't been smart. You haven't been kind. You haven't been kind. You haven't been funny. You haven't been funny. You haven't been creative. You haven't been creative. You haven't been thoughtful. You haven't been thoughtful. You haven't been generous. You haven't been generous. You haven't been talented. You haven't been talented. You haven't been ambitious. You haven't been ambitious. You haven't been helpful. You haven't been helpful. You haven't been caring. You haven't been caring. Have you been smart? Have you been smart? Have you been kind? Have you been kind? Have you been funny? Have you been funny? Have you been creative? Have you been creative? Have you been thoughtful? Have you been thoughtful? Have you been generous? Have you been generous? Have you been talented? Have you been talented? Have you been ambitious? Have you been ambitious? Have you been helpful? Have you been helpful? Have you been caring? Have you been caring? Haven't you been smart? Haven't you been smart? Haven't you been kind? Haven't you been kind? Haven't you been funny? Haven't you been funny? Haven't you been creative? Haven't you been creative? Haven't you been thoughtful? Haven't you been thoughtful? Haven't you been generous? Haven't you been generous? Haven't you been talented? Haven't you been talented? Haven't you been ambitious? Haven't you been ambitious? Haven't you been helpful? Haven't you been helpful? Haven't you been caring? Haven't you been caring? You were smart. You were smart. You were kind. You were kind. You were funny. You were funny. You were creative. You were creative. You were thoughtful. You were thoughtful. You were generous. You were generous. You were talented. You were talented. You were ambitious. You were ambitious. You were helpful. You were helpful. You were caring. You were caring. You weren't smart. You weren't smart. You weren't kind. You weren't kind. You weren't funny. You weren't funny. You weren't creative. You weren't creative. You weren't thoughtful. You weren't thoughtful. You weren't generous. You weren't generous. You weren't talented. You weren't talented. You weren't ambitious. You weren't ambitious. You weren't helpful. You weren't helpful. You weren't caring. You weren't caring. Were you smart? Were you smart? Were you kind? Were you kind? Were you funny? Were you funny? Were you creative? Were you creative? Were you thoughtful? Were you thoughtful? Were you generous? Were you generous? Were you talented? Were you talented? Were you ambitious? Were you ambitious? Were you helpful? Were you helpful? Were you caring? Were you caring? Weren't you smart? Weren't you smart? Weren't you kind? Weren't you kind? Weren't you funny? Weren't you funny? Weren't you creative? Weren't you creative? Weren't you thoughtful? Weren't you thoughtful? Weren't you generous? Weren't you generous? Weren't you talented? Weren't you talented? Weren't you ambitious? Weren't you ambitious? Weren't you helpful? Weren't you helpful? Weren't you caring? Weren't you caring?